Hello, everyone. Welcome to Knock at Night. Let me just make sure we are indeed live. Tech producer, can you see me? Okay, great. We're live. This is very strange to just be, here. Usually I'm on the back end producing Knock at Night, so I'm really excited to be hosting what's really going to be an important and perpetually urgent conversation about housing in Los Angeles, and as well as hopefully touching on a little bit of international housing policy toward the end. We have some really, really incredible guests, including Theo Henderson of We the Unhoused, as well as organizers from End Homelessness Now, who have a great presentation bringing some of their policy expertise into the show. We are so lucky to have everyone. So I'll keep my intro very short. Again, thank you for being here. And first up, we are going to bring in our correspondent from Knock LA, Kate Gallagher. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Hello. So we wanted to bring you in to just give us a little bit of groundwork at the city level. What are some of the big developments that have been going on at the city level in terms of housing, in terms of sweeps, in terms of encampments? I know there's one case in particular that we were just hoping you could give our viewers a little bit of base level grounding knowledge to start us off tonight.
Yeah, so by now most of us know what happened at Echo Park a month and a half ago. The whole encampment at Echo Park Lake was violently removed by the LAPD at the behest of Council Member Mitch O'Farrell. And despite what he's said about this, not everyone who was removed from the encampment was actually placed in housing. It was not exactly the glowing success that it's being made out to be, according to many of the people who were at the encampment. And it's looking like this is kind of going to be a larger citywide strategy for how encampments are dealt with in the future, largely because the CDC guidelines about COVID and not displacing people who are sheltering in place are about to be up. And once that's up, we're kind of at this crossroads of figuring out what's next, what's the new strategy going to be.
Right. Yeah. So basically, it kind of seems as if there's definitely one camp forming on the city council that, in their minds sees what happened at Echo Park Lake as something that they want to replicate across the city, which, if you were anywhere on the ground or anywhere involved in any of that organizing, is completely ridiculous and insane. But that is seen, that very criminalizing approach is seen by many as a success. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this show tonight, is just keeping this energy up and keeping it in the news. And then also really quickly, I was hoping you could touch a little bit on about the what we sort of colloquially are referring to as the Judge Carter case, which has been all over the news. Could you give us a little bit of background on what that is and what that means for the city?
Yeah. So a year ago, in March of 2020, this group called the LA Alliance, which is mostly small business owners and residents of DTLA, filed this lawsuit against the city and county of LA for basically failing to do anything to address the homelessness crisis. This we all know is true. The question is, what are we going to do about it? So the lawsuit is still ongoing, but a few weeks ago, the judge who's overseeing the case, David O. Carter, filed a preliminary injunction, which means the case is still going on, but he's ordering the city and county to do things in the meantime. And it's kind of a doozy. It's 110 pages long, and it starts with the Gettysburg Address. It outlines the whole history of structural racism and housing policy. And then it ends by ordering the city to put $1 billion into escrow for the purposes of housing and other services. And the other major provision that goes along with it is that by October, which is now 5 months from now, the city and county have to offer shelter to every person living on Skid Row. Which sounds good in concept, but the problems that could potentially start here are that that's like a really, really tight turnaround time to find shelter for thousands of people. So, the chances are that the city is going to, want to find the easiest and cheapest option available that still meets the definition of shelter. So that could be like, beds in a congregate shelter. It could mean something like these safe sleeping sites, like what Mitch O'Farrell recently opened, which is essentially an empty parking lot where people are still, sleeping in tents, but like at a like removed place where people don't have to look at it. So that's like kind of the two problems that could emerge from that are that we're putting a lot of people into temporary shelter and spending all of the money on temporary shelter without putting money towards permanent housing to, get them out of the temporary shelter. So there's even concerns that like that money that's now being earmarked for this temporary shelter could cut into money that was supposed to go towards permanent housing. So there's like not a super clear exit plan for like the long term of what's going to happen once these people are offered temporary shelter. The other problem is that once that offer of shelter is made, then the city and county are allowed to enforce any laws against camping or sleeping in public that could essentially be used to arrest anyone who doesn't want to leave Skid Row. So it's likely that that would lead to something like we saw at Echo Park on like an even larger scale, where pretty much anyone who does not want to accept whatever shelter is offered to them is going to be removed from Skid Row by whatever force is necessary.
Okay, so yeah, it's just very helpful to know that, the splashy headlines of everyone on Skid Row is going to be housed by the fall. Not exactly.
I don't want to be too Debbie Downer about it because like we haven't seen how it's going to play out. And this is just like one scenario, which seems to be the most likely scenario. But again, this is still like this injunction was just issued and nothing has been done about it. So I don't want to be too definitive, but that is a likely scenario.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Kate, and thank you so much for your reporting on the ground. Definitely go check out Kate's work at knock.la, including specifically her coverage from the Echo Park Lake situation in April. Really, really good, meaningful work. And please go support knock.la if you can. Join our Patreon, however you can support our writers. Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. And now to get some very, very, very important context further on this situation, both at Echo Park Lake and beyond, we are so excited to welcome Theo Henderson. Theo, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored. This is the second time, but hopefully I don't let you guys down, and hopefully I can answer you guys' questions.
Yeah. Well, there's I truly don't even know where to start. There's so much happening. This is your work every single day. If you don't know, Theo has an incredible podcast called We the Unhoused. Please go subscribe to the Patreon, download it wherever you listen to podcasts. That's first and foremost. But yeah, I if you want to start with what Kate was just speaking about, the ramifications from what happened at Echo Park Lake, and also
it's so many directions to it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I so many directions, so many things. So I don't want to recover ground, but I want to introduce a couple of things. One, the issue is that there are so many complexities of the houselessness issue that many people have certain issues and they have a distrust. And the judge didn't put any teeth behind it. What if they fail? What are the repercussions behind them falling? And the second thing is they are not talking about the criminalization that is going on already, and there's no repercussion from the city or the LAPD or any other of these agencies when they violate the unhoused civil rights. Believe it or not, unhoused people still have civil rights. They have the right to refuse things, and it shouldn't be an if and or scenario, because if we had did this to house people, it would be considered kidnapping or extortion and the like. So just because we have a governmental seal or whatever behind it should not give us that right to do so as well. And I'm thinking about, for example, the unhoused woman I interviewed today. She has 5 children, and she has a physical disability. She should be in a wheelchair, and she can barely walk, and she can barely do the things that's necessary. And I imagine that if they had forced her to make a choice, they could easily blackmail her and say, "We'll take your kids," or if you take unsavory housing solutions. So these things that we don't think about with houselessness is, especially the NIMBYs, and the NIMBYs is an acronym for Not in My Backyard. They basically have a very dystopian and very hostile viewpoint of houselessness. They have summarily wiped out unhoused people as unhuman, beset by mental maladies, substance usage issues, and they use that as a broad brush to criminalize and demonize a large swath of people. I hope I'm answering your question, by the way, because I'm just prattling on.
No, yeah, it's all, you're absolutely right. It's so complicated. And yeah, I would love if you could, you mentioned a little bit about how, this is in a very real way a form of kidnapping if it weren't unhoused people. And there was a report from the LA Times recently about the huge amount of belongings that were recovered. Some people might refer to it as like trash, but really it's people's belongings.
Yeah.
And so I wanted, I think our audience is like generally, pretty understanding, but I am always really grateful when it can be put in perspective of like, what does that mean when all of your belongings only can fit into a certain amount of space, and then what happens to them? So yeah, if you want to speak a little bit on that would be wonderful.
I'm first of all, I have to thank you for bringing that question up, because one, this is 2 things that I grapple with. When I first seen the hit pieces from LA Times, KTLA, Channel 7, East Sider, they have prefaced the article like 35.7 tons of feces and urine. And that graphic image that had resonated with the NIMBYs, that they're using it as a lightning rod to justify this abusive behavior that they did to my unhoused friends and neighbors. So then the second part of it annoys me because I'm a former educator. So and it shows me the lack of educational support that they either have decided to ignore because we haven't asked deeper questions. Number one, how are they measuring the urine? Were they doing it, but did they have bottles and they were putting it into a graph, or they were saying that this was human urine or dogs, because people walk their dogs? The second thing is what they were walking around with calipers and pulling up human feces and measuring it for the purposes of making this article. The second off is the teacher in me, so forgive me. An elephant is over a ton, and they does 300 pounds of defecation a day. And even with that happening, there is, with that to go on, if you've been into any circus, you would know that it will have a odoriferous aroma that would beset you before you even know what's going on. If we had 35.7 pounds of urine and feces, you would have smelled it at least over a mile away. When you have entered the park, you would have been so repulsed and gagged, where those people who have been bringing vendor cars, events there that had that super spreader event, you would have smelled that odoriferous amount of urine and feces. It would have been such a catastrophic or a human debacle that immediately environmental services would have came and wondered if there was a sewage breakage loose. But we also, the second thing is we fail to realize that Mitchell Farrell is at fault for here, because we don't put the onus where it is. And the NIMBYs, that's the third part of it. The second part is Mitchell Farrell deliberately would lock the bathrooms where unhoused people had families and kids that needed to go to the bathroom, and would lock it. He turned off the power. And then when we had the bathrooms, then he would have a security guard to make sure that it was locked at the end of the day. Unhoused people have to go to the restroom like house people. They cannot, it doesn't go into the air. It doesn't fly into the ether. It must go somewhere. So you have to go. And if you don't offer the appropriate things, and it took activism like Street Watch, Cape Town for All, other activists, LA Can, to make a stand and shame him to open up 4 bathrooms, and then he eventually tried to use the same tired tropes as he was going to those house NIMBY thugs and claiming that there was prostitution going on, there was gang activity. He used every playbook in the book to justify dehumanizing human beings for doing the basic of human services. The second, third, last thing is that people at fault about this whole issue is we keep coddling them. The NIMBYs, and the NIMBYs are the not in my backyard. They're the ones that whine and complain when we try to offer solutions. Okay, you don't want to see unhoused people? Fine, all right. We're on the same page. Unhoused people don't want to be out here displaced. Let us find some housing solutions. Then they go into ours. We don't want a shelter in our neighborhood because think of the poor children. Not neglecting the fact that unhoused people like today, there are unhoused families out here. They have children. Their children are just as matters, just more than your damn house kids too. So if they are, you don't want to see other people suffering. What do you imagine how unhoused families feel when they have to hear from these I don't want to lose my cool too much. Ignoramuses that sit up and pass this poison off into these meetings. You don't think your children are hearing this and spreading this on to the other kids that have to suffer and go to school that's unhoused and displaced? So there's so much that I could go into, and I don't want to belabor the point, but the bottom line is these kind of harmful messages is what the reason is. The blame is to the city, to be sure. The blame is Judge Carter did not go far enough into holding Mitchell Farrell accountable for these illegal actions. The federal government didn't think about the civil rights of unhoused people. And most importantly, the NIMBY criminals and thugs that hide behind these horrible things because they have a house and they have a job doesn't give you the right to violate other people's civil rights. Because if the roles were reversed, you'd be writing to your council member and eating the boots of police officers to demonize the vulnerable population.
Yeah, thank you so much. And not even close to losing your cool at all. I know so many people are in awe of you and the work that you do and the work that you've helped others to do in terms of making this is a human issue. So one thing I just wanted to ask was, so during the Echo Park uprisings, protests, we were told that everyone at Echo Park Lake had been offered, I don't know if they even said housing or shelter or whatever. Can you comment on that? Was that true? And where are they now? Are they in luxury hotel rooms? How are they doing? Was that promise fulfilled?
Let me stop that question, and I thank you for that question. But I wanted to start to praise a few people about this issue, because during the course of this, the city council, particularly Mitchell Farrell, the LAPD, and LASA, and some of the Urban Alchemy, are running around and saying these activists that are not getting paid are preventing people from getting into shelter and telling them to stay on the streets. That is not the case. I want to take a shout out to Ashley Bennett. Ashley Bennett, way before she became a part of Ground Game, was telling honestly the unhoused community that there were no availability. They didn't have anything opening. But during the course of the COVID-19 and to the pandemic, she has been placing, despite when all of the criminalization actions that were going on, she was placing people on her own power and home volition in hotels, trying to juggle and find places for people to be, way before Mitchell Farrell decided to create this lie that says he's housed all these people. So the pat on the back really deserve a person that is not employed by the city, that was fired by the express directive of Mitchell Farrell. The second person that has made it a point, as long as and has been vilified unjustly, was Jed Perriott of trying to consolidate and get the house people the basic things. That was for example, bathroom usage, basically trying to find options that would be sensitive to people that have substance usage and having harm reduction. The third thing about it is that the investigation that I did, and I've talked to unhoused people that had been displaced, and I covered on the ground the very night that it is a lie, because they were sent to shelters and they were supposed to be going, and they sent one of the guys out there to Palmdale. They had no rooms and nothing available, and he spent his nights outside the Palmdale shelter. So in essence, he put them into other neighborhoods, and they have NIMBYs in those areas too. So what do you think that's going to happen? Now the Palmdale police have to deal with his elephant feces, or his 35.5 tons of problems that he dumped on someone else's. So let's be clear that he has not done that. He has gotten, and he handpicked certain people that are vulnerable, and they made it make it sound like he's done these wonderful things. And I call them sycophants because they don't realize the damage that he's caused to other unhoused people. And he skipped over the line the week before and said that there was no places for them to go. But all of a sudden, March 24th and 25th, he magically has all of these over a 209 shelter or availabilities or Project Room Key availability for people. It's just basically a lie. He tried to use it to justify his criminal actions, and it's a very disappointing that the mainstream media has failed in its journalistic integrity to really put the fire to him and dispute these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for all that. Palmdale is, it's so far, it's just shuffling problems, shirking it off to different cities, different police, sheriff's departments. So I actually, the last thing I wanted to cover is a little bit of a shift. So listening to your episode, one of your podcast episodes today, and I don't know if you would call it like a tagline or a motto, but something you say a lot is "Let us meet in the light of understanding." And I was wondering if you could take a little bit of time to explain what that means to you and why that is featured. So those words are, I've heard you say them so many times. Why does that speak to you? Is it an organizing principle? Did you learn it somewhere? Specifically, I know in Streetwatch, I have been able to hear your perspective on a lot of things, specifically regarding how, we don't engage with certain people's views. We expect people to rise up and listen to the perspectives that matter. So when I was listening to the podcast today, that line really struck me. And how do you keep that? What does that mean to you? And how do you have, honestly, the discipline really to have that as like a guidance rather than, every day arguing with NIMBYs on Instagram?
It's so many layers to this question, but to be honest, like when I was a younger person, like yesterday, I was reading Malcolm X's and listened to his speeches, and he said that. And then when I became an educator myself, and it took a different resonance for me as an educator at heart. I have witnessed students having challenges or challenging belief systems in themselves or erroneous information. And once they had the light of understanding or the light of comprehension comes on, it changes the vista of confusion, and it opens up many doors where you could have empathy, compassion, and not only that, a call to action to do something. And in order for us to, when we navigate these treacherous waters with shark-infested city council members, police officers, and NIMBYs, we are always beset by the millstone to be dragged down into pointless arguments, misunderstandings, disinformation, like what I just elucidated on earlier, and most importantly, hatred of people and dehumanizing them. And when I do this podcast, it is always my hope. It's like, first and foremost, it is for the unhoused community to have a sense of hope and understand that there is a place for them. They are seen, they are respected, they are loved, and they are heard. The second community that I want to, as people that genuinely have been tired of this misinformation, and to find hope themselves and also find a deeper understanding in their activism, because they may have some of the tools, but they may not have all of the tools, or they may not be able to articulate fairly well the complexities that beset unhoused people. And what better way of learning at the seat of people that have the expertise, which is the unhoused community. Conversely, where if you see in other panels and other organizations, like the last one I went to, and I vowed that I would never do another of those panels again. I was invited, and they had all of these people that were housed, like the mayor, the congressman, and none of these people have spent one day being unhoused. They had 2 hours an hour and a half of time bloviating and pontificating about issues that they have no experience with, but they're beset with the responsibility of trying to solve this problem. And at the end of the day, they asked me for 3 minutes to try to encapsulate all of the issues that beset unhoused people's realities. And it was like so annoying and so offensive. And they paid these people, obviously, they're going to pay these people, but the people with the lived experience, they pay them nothing. This is the inequities that go on. And I feel that I have been very blessed because of my experience of being educated, though I've been unhoused, is that I can open this door and kind of lean on it so that more unhoused voices can run through and get in there and be able to affect a lot of the differences, along with some of the activism and the younger generation that I'm very encouraged to see that has really are trying to just dismantle or just disbelieve the older generation's myopic reasons about houselessness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think another thing that we've sort of been we were talking a little bit about earlier is how you were on the show probably about a year ago at this point, and obviously so much has changed since then. So you just said, you're hopeful with the younger generations, but how has this past year, if you were to maybe reflect on some of the big changes of this past year, because it wasn't so long ago that the last protests at Echo Park Lake were happening, and those had a different response. So how do you view this past year that's been sort of bookended by these really, really remarkable shows of solidarity with the unhoused community?
I have to say the perfect metaphor that I had and I mentioned earlier was about if you ever see those roller coaster rides where it starts off slow or has a little bit of it, then all of a sudden it abruptly drops. And I think the best way to describe this year is that we're still in the roller coaster. I'm holding on with my little my teddy bear, my thumb in my mouth. Some people are screaming for dear life. Some people are puking. Some people are just closing their eyes, hoping this gets over soon. And I think that's one of the things I think which really has been going on. Like, I wanted to point out something. What makes Echo Park so unique, what I have to say, is that the friendships that I had when I first started Weedy Unhoused, the lion's share of my podcast was started there. And they were so gracious. They was patient with me because I was living in the park and I had a faulty phone. It would come in and off. It was broken, and I'm recording it. I've got to go. I'm like, oh man, I couldn't save it because I had little power and I had to wait. I had to run back and charge it up. Then come back again to do it again. So they were so gracious. They were so good to me, so kind. And they would they were patient. They were explaining things. Though I was unhoused, there was dimensions of understanding even and houselessness that I didn't know because I learned at the feet of people that were fleeing domestic abuse. I understood that. I learned at the feet of people that had traumatic brain injury and why they can't get a job when someone's telling them to get a job. Mm-hmm. I sat at the feet of people that had spent all their money on his wife that had brain cancer and ended up out on the street. I learned at the feet of Freddie, who had lost his girlfriend, and him and her had worked at a building, and he was sleeping outside the very building that he used to manage. I learned so much from people there and their lives and things, and they were so giving. And I always say it was a gift because they gave me the gift of opening up their lives. They give me the gift of spreading their story so people can understand that they were human beings first, and life happens to everybody. We all make mistakes. We all make successes, and houselessness should not be the punishment for anybody. I don't want this world. That's one I did. I don't want this world. 5 years ago, I was brutally stabbed in 8 places, and I almost lost my life. I don't want that type of life being out here on the street for anybody. I have a host of other health issues before when I got on the street, when I was out of my coma. I don't want people like my friend, Mr. Bill, who's suffering from skin cancer and so chemotherapy. I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with my friend Marissa having 5 kids. I've lost her husband from a hit and run. She was dealing with a hit and run and dragged for over 5 miles and almost lost her infant child. I don't want that kind of lifestyle for anybody. I don't care if you see unhoused people having a mental episode. That's one of the things we need to start to have a conversation about. The stigmatization of people with mental health. You cannot beat them into submission, and we cannot use the police to kill them or incarcerate them, and to get so we don't see them, so we can enjoy our pumpkin spice lattes. So there it is.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Theo. This is, such an important. It's important isn't even big enough of a word. Like, this is the perspective that everyone in Los Angeles and around the world needs. We have more to talk about, so we will bring you back at the end in about 15, 20 minutes. But thank you so much. Again,
thank you for having me.
Of course, Theo's Venmo is right here. That, goes to Theo, it goes to the podcast, and it goes to literally all the work he's doing on the ground every day. So if you have the means, please go and support Theo. And thank you so much. We'll see you in a bit.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. So now we are moving on, and I'm very delighted to invite the team from End Homelessness Now, LA. We've got Jess Stever, Val Carlson, and let's see if Jeff is here. Jeff was having some video problems earlier, so we might just have his voice. So Jeff and Val, if you would like to unmute, and then we can get started. Should I pull up the slideshow, or do you want to do some introductions first?
Yeah, go ahead and pull it up.
Great.
My name's Jess Stever. I live in Los Angeles, and I'm a member of End Homelessness Now. Val, do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Val Carlson. I'm also a member of End Homelessness Now, Los Angeles. Also a member of the Freedom Socialist Party and the National Lawyers Guild, organizations that have been fighting for the rights of unhoused people for decades, and happy to be here tonight.
And Jeff?
And I'm Jeff Lazansky, and I'm also a member of End Homelessness Now, LA.
Cool beans.
Thank you so much for being here. So yeah, let's get right into it. Jess, if you or Jess or Val, if you just want to tell us about End Homelessness Now, the LA campaign, what you've been doing in Los Angeles, and what you all are up to.
Okay, I'll start. End Homelessness Now, Los Angeles is a broad-based grassroots campaign that promotes large-scale, permanent, supportive public housing and social housing as the solution to the homelessness catastrophe in Los Angeles. We can stay on the first slide for a while here, actually. Our members and supporters are representatives of community organizations, unions, housing rights activists, and people who are or have been unhoused. We came together in 2018 when we saw that the city was going to squander the $1.2 billion in tax money that Los Angeles voters agreed to tax themselves to try to provide at least 10,000 units of permanent supportive housing for our unhoused neighbors. But we soon learned that they weren't going to get anywhere near that goal. They would get at best 5,000 or 6,000 units, and they were each going to cost over $500,000 each. Worse yet, this housing would not be permanent. Its private owners, the developers and landlords who were in charge of creating this housing, only had to agree to provide this very low income rent supportive housing for 55 years, after which they could charge whatever rent they wanted, and thousands of people would be homeless once again. 55 years may seem like a long time, but this is corporate welfare on steroids when it really comes down to it. We soon reached the conclusion that the solution had to be public housing, because housing, like education and healthcare, should be a human right. Capitalists' profits should not determine who's housed and who isn't. Homelessness is also a direct failure of our city and county officials to prioritize human life over corporate greed. And Theo has told us a lot about that already. We also learned that the city and the county have a lot of vacant and underused properties that could be utilized for this kind of public housing. We also learned that high quality modular housing could be built quickly and at a cost of only $100,000 to $120,000 per unit. For example, the old county general hospital that's been closed since 2008 could provide homes for 1,000 people. The county is looking into turning that into housing, again, using the developer private landlord model, but we want them to use it for permanent and public housing and social housing so that it's there forever. There are also a lot of large vacant lots all over the city. Go ahead to the next slide. That could be used. There's a giant 10-acre one just south of Watts. There's a 17-acre one on Tyrone Street up in Van Nuys, 7 acres at Slauson and South Wall, a big 3-acre place at 60th and Southwestern that we've been promoting in particular. And there's lots of libraries and fire stations and other empty formerly city buildings that could easily be transferred into housing. Once they get that started, they do for one, they can replicate for others. And all of these are a lot less expensive because to start with, there's no cost to acquire the land, which is often a third of the cost of some of this housing. In addition to promoting public and social housing, we have also called on the city to follow the recommendations of people with lived experience in planning and designing all this kind of housing that is needed. We call on them to house people immediately without restrictive admission requirements. There's currently a 26-page questionnaire that people have to fill out to even start getting into the system. And getting housing, if you're unhoused, is worse than trying to apply for a PhD at a top college. And we also, in particular, call on them to stop criminalizing unhoused people and provide the restrooms and all of the facilities immediately for people who are having to live on the streets, and then get about the business of the permanent housing that makes a difference. Over the course of the several years, we have given lots of public statements, held press conferences and rallies, gone to meetings, canvassed neighborhoods, and gathered petition signatures, all to try to build community support for this type of housing. Finally, in November, the City Council passed a motion asking the city administration to look into the possibility of social housing here in Los Angeles, study examples from elsewhere in the world, and also ways to fund it, feasibility of it, and come back with a report. We think that the order to have that report be meaningful, that it's important for them to know that we are serious about it, the community supports it. So far, we've had over 50 organizations sign on as endorsers to a letter with recommendations that we've made for the type of social housing that we need. And also about a dozen neighborhood councils have signed on. So we are working every way we can to try to put the pressure on, give it the street heat that maybe can make a difference in this vast bureaucracy that is the city and county of Los Angeles. And with that, I'll stop and we'll move on to Jeff and the next slide.
Oh,
There we go.
There we go. So to talk a little bit more about social housing and kind of like challenge some of the misconceptions that sometimes happen around social housing, is I just wanted people to just take a look at this inside this like housing unit, and just like look at it and think about if you would be able to afford to live in a place like this based on the income that you make. And I know for me, there is no way, like for sure, that I'd be able to afford it. But this is actually an example of a social housing unit in Singapore. And in Singapore, like other places, people are able to afford to live in high quality places like this, regardless of their income. And that's through like the social housing model that we want to promote. So next slide. So what is social housing? So social housing is, and this is really key, is that it is housing, it is kept permanently off the private market. So people don't have to worry about losing their homes, and to happen, like what Val mentioned, often happens with in the private market. And this happens because this housing is either owned through the public, like through the government, or it can be owned through the community. And rent for this housing is determined, well, there are a couple of different ways. It can be income-based. So for example, some people would not pay more than say 20% of their income towards their rent. And Another way of for rent is also cost-based, meaning based on the construction and maintenance of the units. Another really key thing to keep in mind is that this housing is also mixed income. And so the rent of the higher income helps people that are in the lower income threshold be able to live in and to be able to afford these spaces. And also the rent, all of the rent goes towards maintenance of the unit and construction of new units. And so therefore, it's a more self-sustaining model than what we currently have. So the next slide for Jess is going to give more examples into social housing around the world.
Yeah, so I'm going to go over some international models, starting with Vienna. So about 60% of Vienna residents live in social housing, and 80% of people in Austria qualify. So social housing in Vienna was created by socialists in government post World War I by taxing the wealthy so that laborers would have nice homes where they could not only rest but thrive. What a concept. Some blocks, like this one shown, were used as fortresses to defend against the fascists in World War II. And after the war, they were purposed again into social housing and remain that way today. Could we go to the next slide? So this example in Singapore. So in Singapore today, over 80% of residents live in social housing. And this picture here is of a block of social housing in Marine Parade, which is a town that comprises of 58 blocks of social housing with infrastructure to support the residents, such as a shopping promenade, a community building, and a variety of primary and secondary schools. The community was constructed in the 70s after the reclamation of the island's east coast, which means that they actually created more land on their shoreline to build these structures. And then the third example is on the next slide from Brussels. So this complex here is called Le Lorraine, which is a repurposed old iron dealer facility. It consists of a multi-unit apartment building, 3 larger homes, and an open communal space. And it's kind of gorgeous to look at. So if there are any lessons to be learned from these international examples, they are these. One, that there's no one way to do social housing. Different localities in this country, including LA, can create models of social housing to fit the specific needs of our communities. 2, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Existing structures can be utilized to create housing faster and more cheaply, while remaining true to the character and history of a place, as is the case in Vienna and Brussels, and as could be the case in LA with all of our vacant and underused property that Val talked about. 3, that where there is a political will, there is a way. If Singapore can create more land to build housing on, then the red tape and bureaucratic excuses that we face in LA, they're not really excuses at all. And lastly, that public housing can be beautiful. Poor people can live in beautiful places. If you think of public housing and think of some rundown, dejected property, that's because the public housing model employed in the US is a failure of our government's political will to invest in its people and acknowledge that housing is a human right. So we have the opportunity and duty right now to change all of that. So I think next and lastly, we want to talk a little bit about what can be done to make social housing a reality in LA. I think we might have lost. No, there's Jeff. Jeff, you're right in time for your part. Oh, wait, actually, this is my part. I'm just kidding. So anyway, I'm going to answer my own question. What can be done to make this happen in LA? So to start to answer that, I'm going to look a little more deeply at what we're doing wrong in LA. And a lot of that has to do with how we spend our money. This graph shows that the mayor's proposed 2021-22 budget gives way too much money to policing, $3.5 billion, and way too little to permanent supportive housing. It's 382 million with an M. So it's time to slash the bloated police budget. Stop the pretextual traffic stops that harass and kill people of color. Stop using the police to tear down homeless encampments and persecute and criminalize unhoused people. Transferring an additional $1 billion from the police and into permanent public housing would yield over 8,000 units of modular housing at $120,000 each to build them. We did that every year until the end of the decade. We could end homelessness in LA. So the next chart, this shows the amount of residential development that was taking place in downtown LA in 2019. Private developers were creating over 41,000 luxury hotel rooms, condos, and market rate apartments. Meanwhile, only 376 units of the HHH permanent supportive housing were in the pipeline. So it should also be noted that there are about 100,000 vacant apartments in LA. There's not 100,000 homeless people in LA. So this is just a very visually stimulating example of why we need to be creating large-scale permanent supportive housing, because we don't need to be building more apartments that no one can afford to live in. And so I'm going to pass it off to Jeff to talk about some stuff that's going on in California legislation.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So as Val mentioned, so the good news is we are kind of seeing some movement happening right now around social housing. Val already mentioned what's happening in Los Angeles, that because of Mike Bonin and the motion that he passed at the city council then approved, city agencies are currently looking into the feasibility of developing social housing in Los Angeles. Also this year, Assembly Member Alex Lee put forth a bill, AB 387, for the purpose of looking into developing social housing in California. So we are seeing some good, promising movement, but it's really important, though, that if we want to see the kind of social housing that we want, where everyone can afford to live in a home, be secure, is one, to really raise much more public awareness on social housing, like showing the feasibility of it, showing the promise of it, like getting people excited about it. Like think about being able to always be able to afford to live in a nice quality place. Like that just sounds like such an incredible dream that I think we could really get people excited around. So doing educationals, which is one reason why we wanted to get on this program. And then also just really, we talked about it, but just really pressuring our elected officials, letting them know hey, this is something we want done. This is something that can get done. And this is really important because we're currently seeing, so for example, with AB 387, we're already starting to see some watering down of the language. There's been going to get pressure from different special interest groups to water down the language more. And so if we want to have a really strong bill come out, and we still have that say, the language is still being crafted, right? So is really raising the public awareness, putting pressure on the elected officials to make sure the bill is strong as possible. And same with the motion is we're kind of hearing some words that maybe, the report is not going to be as strong as we want. So again, just putting that pressuring agencies, letting the city council know we want strong social housing is going to be really important, really key. Also, reach out to your neighborhood councils. The elected officials, they listen to those neighborhood councils. So reach out to your neighborhood council, build support. And just like as an example of like really showing what can happen when we actually really do try to put pressure on elected officials. In West Hollywood, we had a great success where one of our members, Jordan David, brought to our attention and then actually took leadership on getting the West Hollywood City Council to shift their plans from what was originally going to be like this temporary homeless shelter to not only focus on to have that development, actual permanent supportive housing, but to also look into the feasibility of developing social housing in West Hollywood. So that's a huge victory that to me like really puts a spark in my step and shows like we can really get this done. And with that, I will pass it over to Val.
And Val, you're muted if you want to unmute.
Thank you. Well, here's some immediate things that people can do. First of all, we're still gathering endorsements on our letter about social housing. So far, about 50 different organizations have signed on. We're not just telling the city to do it. We're trying to tell them what they should do based on what we've learned is feasible and workable and successful in other places, which is now to start by really treating this as an emergency, getting the housing built, involving people with lived experience in all phases of it, starting with the vacant property, underused property, consider purchasing more hotels, repurposing office buildings. Not everybody's going to go back to work in an office building after this COVID thing, and there's even more space available. Maintain the public ownership and public operation of it, and provide for meaningful participation in building governance by the people who live there. One of the things that happens in these shelter situations is that they treat people like children. They have curfews. If you miss a meal, if you leave after 7 o'clock at night and before 7 a.m., you can get kicked out, and it becomes a very miserable situation. People need to be able to be engaged and create their own kind of communities. We saw at Echo Park Lake that people who were unhoused that lived there for a long time created communities and supported each other. This can happen, and it needs to happen. So we want them to not only do it, but do it soon. Our meetings are first and third Saturdays. There are some Zoom links here for the next ones that are coming up, but you can always find out what we're doing next and what's happening on our Facebook page at In Homelessness Now LA. And finally, there looks like there's going to be a budget hearing on May 20th, at which time we're inviting people to call in, give public comment, and continue to push the city to really use the budget wisely, use the money that's coming in from state and federal sources, and get enough housing done to make a difference.
Well, thank you so much. That was such an incredible presentation. Before we bring Theo back in, I was wondering, Jess or whoever, could you repeat how many percentage of the population lives in social housing? And like, I know you said the Philippines was like over 80%.
Singapore is 80%.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, and Vienna is similarly as high.
Yeah, well, Vienna is 60%, and you know what that speaks to for me is, Theo was talking a lot about NIMBYs, right? Mm-hmm. And I know in Koreatown several years ago, for example, there was a big push against creating shelters in Koreatown because, they didn't want to attract homelessness to Koreatown. First of all, homelessness is there, whether they admit it or not, but there's the stigma against like public housing and low income housing as well as shelters, and it doesn't have to be that way. If we actually invest money in the housing, put our money where our mouths are, then it can be beautiful and it can be for everybody. So yeah, that's really what to see that example like in Singapore and in Vienna, that everybody of mixed incomes and different classes can live in this housing and it can raise everybody up. Like why can't we do that here?
Exactly. Well, I'm going to bring Theo back in. I see you nodding vigorously on the back end. Theo, one thing I struck me while listening to this presentation is like that similar tone of like, as organizers, we don't one of the biggest lessons I've learned is, and what we were saying before, is that you don't stoop down to the level of the people who, are so far behind in learning this stuff. You lead by example, and you trust that they will catch up, and you trust that they will, meet in the light of understanding. So just wanted to see what you have to say about the presentation and the social housing and all of this stuff.
Well, I think one of the things too is like education is also the passport anywhere. Malcolm X said that, and I do believe that. And one of the things that I have to give the devil his due is they have a very good propaganda machine. They're able to spread like a insidious poison, bad disinformation. And I think one of us in activism, which is what I do, Witty Unhoused and other things, is we have to create an educational vacuum where people are seeing our reality and our images and the reality of houselessness, about social housing. I don't know if any of you, I'm old here, so I do remember, this is over 20 years ago, that they had this drug thing where they had this scrambled egg and it said, "This is your brain on drugs." Now that example, if people remember that, resonates, and I remember that. If they can do that about that, what do you think if we had the same kind of intellectual, creative wherewithal to create the same kind of imagery about houselessness? Housing is a human right. No one should be left behind, in houselessness. There is a war on poverty. The poverty is not, and the war should not be on people. It should be on the systematic issues that lie in to houselessness and poverty. Livable wages is possible. These kind of things, these kind of slogans and mantras that we keep saying that and pushing that out there, that they pass as they're going for their pumpkin spice lattes. They see a big billboard of that up there, and the youth are watching that, and they're seeing on the commercials like they used to have after school specials. I think like that's what I'm trying to do with Weedy and House, the creator Weedy and House for kids, understanding because houselessness is affecting not only just the older generation, it's affecting the elderly generation. You can't tell an 80-year-old woman that has dementia that she's got to pull herself up by her bootstrap and she's got to get a job. That's just not going to get it. It's just, I mean, it just, and it's rising in LA, the elderly population that is unhoused. Imagine telling your mother, like my mother was 84, and I'm telling her that she's in the in twilight of her life, telling her, well, you know what? It's too bad, so bad. If you had saved your money, if you had found you a better job, then you wouldn't be out here on the street. Can you see you telling your parents or your grandparents that? No. Then why would you tell other elderly people that are unhoused out here that they deserve what they got? So these kind of conversations that NIMBYs never want to have, they're more comfortable with having the whole populace thinking about the lifestyle of a duck or the wildlife population in Echo Park than the realities of the cross stitch of houselessness and every facet in every age group and every intersection, from the LGBTQ that's been running away from home because they had came in and stood in their own truth and their family couldn't accept them because of religious fervor or homophobia or transphobia, or the mother that's running away because she is the abuser has abused her, and the only outcome is living out on the street. But here comes some damn NIMBY seeing them and calling CPS and having the police threaten to separate the families. These are the realities that I see. And I think this is one of the things that the rest of the world needs to be educated on, what really is houselessness and really what the causes is, and how younger generation, the gentleman that was out there since he was a kid, his mother was unhoused. He was unhoused at 13. Another gentleman was unhoused since he was 10 because he was in foster care and the people were abusive, and he decided to live on his wits. We don't talk about those stories.
Yeah. And also something that I wanted to see, maybe Val, if you wanted to speak a little bit about. So what happens a lot, and in the wake of the Echo Park Lake situation, is this like retort that's like, oh, everyone is getting shelter. So I think you talked a little bit about how important it is to push back on the like if you could just talk a little bit about why the language is so important of like permanent supportive housing versus all of the other things, that all of the other loose terms that are used to try and like assuage people in the moment. I'm sure that you have a lot of head banging about that sort of thing.
Well, yes. The city has been focusing for the last several years on some very expensive temporary shelter type solutions instead of getting the permanent housing built. The whole concept a couple of years ago came along this thing called bridge housing, and they started spending $3 to $5 million on tents that they plunked around different places. Congregate care, which can only house about half the people that they're meant to because of COVID. They put those up. They are creating tool shed houses at $100,000 each, ridiculously. They're spending $2,000 a month just to have people have a painted square on a parking lot. Until they actually bite the bullet, see that the elephant in the room is the lack of housing in the first place. This bridge stuff is supposed to be people come there, then they get put into housing. There's no housing to put people into. It's a bridge, nothing on the other side of the bridge. This talk about Echo Park and claiming that they're helping people out. I mean, our members were up there working with the community and helping people and having people get sent to a place that didn't keep them, or they got to one hotel and they got kicked out of that and they got changed. Sometimes for no reason, they just got moved around, or they couldn't get in the first place. One guy couldn't get back into the park to get his tools. He actually had a laborer's job. Another thing that people don't realize is that a significant portion of the unhoused population are people who are already working. They just can't get first and last month rent together to be able to do anything. Or they have veterans benefits, so they're on Social Security. And so this shelter is, unfortunately, Judge Carter is kind of overly focused on shelter and not enough on the permanent housing. Until you have the permanent housing, the shelter stuff is just a great big shell game that is a displacement and a disruption and really persecution of our unhoused neighbors.
Yeah, that's a strong but totally accurate word to describe the situation. And then I know we're almost out of time, but this is such an important and great conversation. I do want to just highlight and uplift the focus that your presentation had on this international connection with housing. It's very easy to get so ingrained in the nitty gritty at the local municipal level, but housing really is a universal struggle. And Theo and I, and we were talking a little bit earlier today about this. So Theo, I wanted to see if you wanted to sort of bridge this, amazing presentation showing us about how possible public housing and how popular it is in other areas of the world with some housing struggles on the international level, and like why is that to you? Why is that important? Why should national housing situation?
Therefore, never sin for whom the bell tolls, because the bell tolls is thee. John Donne said that. And one of the things is that we are inextricably linked by the garment of destiny. Dr. King says that. And one of the things that I've seen along with the Palestinian struggle, and they're talking about it as a conflict. It's not a conflict. It's a one-sided battle to displace and demoralize a vulnerable population. Conversely, it's the same thing that's happened here. There is no conflict. There is a displacement apparatus in place in both arenas to displace, criminalize, and vilify people. But social housing and the solutions have always been here. But the reality is we have been beset by structural entities in place, particularly racism, gentrification, and the viewpoint, and that we have been coddling NIMBYs for too long and letting them control the narrative about this vulnerable people. One of the things, in order for a successful story to be successful in fiction, that we have to have a heroine or hero, and we have a antagonist and a protagonist. Antagonist, and the antagonist has always been the oppressed and vulnerable people. And until we change the story, then we're going to always have that. And I'm going to leave you with the African proverb: till the lion is able to write his own story, the story will always be the victor is the hunter. So there you have it.
Yep. Thank you so much, Theo. And thank you, Val, Jess, Jeff, Can you remind us one more time what people should be looking towards right now? I know you said a budget meeting on the 20th. Your meetings are every first and third Saturday, did you say?
First and third.
First and third Saturday. Great.
First and third Saturday. And then the last thing is, if you are part of an organization that would like to endorse our letter in support of social housing in LA, you can fill out a form at bit.ly// social housing LA. And yeah.
Great. And Jeff, any last words?
No, I'm still here. Yeah, I just turned off my camera because it's getting a little bit spotty. I didn't want to lose you all.
Yeah, well, we're glad you're here in voice and spirit. Thank you all so much. This was such an incredible show. Again, we've got Theo's Venmo. Please listen to We the Unhoused. Have your organization sign on to End Homelessness Now's letter. I feel like this was a very inspiring conversation. I'm feeling good about, the chaos of last year where it's fleeting, and we wouldn't be able to do it without people like you. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. All right. Well, that does it for us here at Knock at Night. I just wanted to leave everyone with this beautiful image of this apartment in Brussels, because that's crazy. I want to live there. Thank you so much for joining. Again, please donate. Please sign on to all the initiatives listed and check out all these meetings. And thank you so much for watching. This was a lot of fun. And I will see you all, I don't know when, but have a good Wednesday night. Thanks, everyone.